The Zephyrian Empire had spent the better part of 3 millennia convincing the galaxy that they were, without question, the most terrifying thing to ever crawl out of a primordial swamp and declare themselves masters of the universe. And honestly, they had a pretty solid case. Picture, if you will, a species that combined the worst aspects of a praying mantis, a shark, and that one neighbor who calls the homeowners association about your lawn height. Standing 8 feet tall on chitinous legs that could punch through starship hulls, the Zephyrians possessed 4 arms, ending in claws that made surgical scalpels look like butter knives. Their exoskeletons shimmered with bio-integrated technology that would make any self-respecting cyborg weep with envy, and their compound eyes could track 17 different targets simultaneously while calculating the most efficient way to disembowel each one. But the truly unsettling part wasn't their physical prowess. No, what kept other species awake at night was their hive mind capability. Imagine playing chess against an opponent who could think with 1,000 brains simultaneously, except the chess pieces were battleships and the board was the entire galaxy. The Zephyrians didn't just coordinate military actions, they orchestrated them like a symphony of destruction, with each individual warrior perfectly synchronized to the collective will. Their biotechnology was equally impressive and horrifying. They grew their ships like other species grew houseplants, nurturing kilometer-long vessels from genetic templates that combined organic efficiency with technological enhancement. These living warships could heal battle damage, adapt to new threats, and reproduce if given enough time and resources. It was like fighting an enemy whose weapons evolved faster than your tactics could adapt. For 3,000 years, this combination of biological superiority, technological advancement, and collective intelligence had kept the Zephyrian Empire at the apex of the galactic food chain. Other species paid tribute, signed non-aggression pacts, or simply found reasons to conduct their business in entirely different spiral arms. The crystalline hegemony, despite their ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level, gave the Zephyrians a respectfully wide berth. The void swimmers, masters of interdimensional travel, preferred to swim through alternate realities rather than deal with Zephyrian territorial claims. Even the Trade Federation, those magnificent bastards who could sell refrigeration units to ice world inhabitants, had developed an entire economic model based on not annoying the Zephyrians. Director Malek, a being whose species had evolved from predatory accountants, had once famously declared that profit margins were important, but profit margins didn't matter much when you were being digested in a Zephyrian breeding sack. The galaxy had achieved a sort of terrified equilibrium. Everyone knew their place, everyone paid their dues to the appropriate powers, and everyone went about their business with the comfortable knowledge that as long as you didn't poke the apex predators, you could live a reasonably peaceful existence, selling luxury goods to minor civilizations and complaining about import tariffs. Then humanity happened. The first reports were dismissed as clerical errors. Some upstart species from the Orion arm, barely past the point of controlled fusion, was apparently causing incidents in the outer trade routes. The initial assumption was that these humans were just another batch of primitive mammals who'd figured out faster-than-light travel before developing the common sense to use it responsibly. The galaxy had seen this before. Usually such species either learned proper galactic etiquette within a few decades, or natural selection took care of the problem for everyone. But humans, as it turned out, had a peculiar relationship with natural selection. Rather than being weeded out by it, they seemed to take it as a personal challenge. Captain Rex Donovan of the human vessel Defiant Wanderer was a prime example of this phenomenon. A stocky man with graying hair and the kind of smile that made experienced diplomats reach for their emergency contact lists, Donovan had somehow managed to turn interstellar commerce into what could only be described as organized chaos, with a profit motive. His ship itself was a testament to human engineering philosophy, which appeared to be based on the principle that if something wasn't held together with improvised repairs and sheer bloody-mindedness, it probably wasn't working hard enough. The Defiant Wanderer looked like someone had taken a proper starship design and then asked a committee of caffeinated engineers to improve it while under deadline pressure. It bristled with weapons that had no business being on a civilian vessel, sported armor plating that had clearly been salvaged from at least 6 different ship classes, and somehow maintained structural integrity despite violating approximately 47 known laws of physics. The crew was equally impressive, in the way that natural disasters are impressive. Zoe Blackwood, the chief engineer, had apparently learned her trade by convincing machinery to work through a combination of technical expertise and what could only be described as mechanical intimidation. She could make a ship's engines run on fuel they weren't designed for, in configurations that shouldn't be possible, while maintaining power outputs that made other engineers question their life choices. The navigator, Tommy Chen, had the unsettling ability to find hyperspace routes that officially didn't exist, cutting travel times by ridiculous margins, while occasionally emerging from FTL jumps in locations that cartographers insisted were mathematically impossible. The weapons officer, Maria Santos, treated ship-to-ship combat like a particularly violent form of interpretive dance, favoring tactics that were simultaneously brilliant and completely insane. Together, they had managed to turn what should have been routine cargo runs into events that required incident reports filed in triplicate with multiple galactic regulatory agencies. The pattern was always the same. Human traders would arrive at a system, conduct their business with cheerful efficiency, and then somehow find themselves in situations that started with, well, we were just minding our own business when, and ended with local security forces filing damage reports that read like disaster movie scripts. It wasn't that humans were particularly aggressive, at least not more than any other species with a functioning survival instinct. The problem was their approach to problem solving, which seemed to involve taking the most logical solution and then asking, but what if we did something completely different instead? When pirates attempted to raid human cargo ships, the expected response would be to surrender, flee, or die heroically while following established protocols. Humans, however, would do things like reprogram their cargo containers to explode in sequence, creating a devastating chain reaction that cleared the entire raiding fleet while somehow leaving their own ship intact. Or they'd broadcast fake distress signals that lured the pirates into elaborate traps involving improvised gravitational anomalies and weaponized cargo drones. The really disturbing part was that these tactics worked. Not only did they work, but they worked so well that other species started trying to copy them, usually with catastrophic results. Apparently, human-style improvisation required a specific kind of creative insanity that couldn't be easily replicated. Ambassador Thule Din of the Crystalline Hegemony had been among the first to recognize the scope of the problem. As a being whose species communicated through harmonic resonance and whose thought processes operated on quantum principles, Thule Din was accustomed to dealing with alien psychology. But humans, Thule Din reported to the Emergency Diplomatic Conclave, were tactically unpredictable to a degree that borders on the supernatural. The ambassador's report had included detailed analysis of 17 separate incidents involving human traders, each one demonstrating what Thule Din termed aggressive creativity. In one case, a human cargo ship had apparently defeated a Razorclaw raiding squadron by convincing them that the cargo hold contained a virulent space plague, then using the pirates' own biological warfare protocols to trap them in their ships while human authorities rounded them up. In another incident, human traders had somehow turned a routine customs inspection into a 3-day diplomatic crisis that ended with the customs officials apologizing and offering the humans a trade discount. The diplomatic conclave had initially approached the situation with standard first contact protocols. Surely these humans could be reasoned with, brought into the established galactic order through proper channels and appropriate incentives. A series of diplomatic missions were dispatched to human space, carrying the usual combination of technological gifts, trade agreements, and gently worded suggestions about proper galactic behavior. The results were, the first diplomatic mission returned with reports that humans were polite but concerning. They had accepted the technological gifts with gratitude, examined them with obvious interest, and then somehow reverse-engineered them into configurations that the original designers insisted were impossible. The trade agreements had been accepted enthusiastically, but human interpretation of the terms had led to commercial activities that technically followed the letter of the law, while completely violating its spirit. The second diplomatic mission never returned. They were later found on a human colony world, where they had apparently decided to retire from diplomatic service and take up what they described as much less stressful careers in fields ranging from extreme sports instruction to experimental cuisine. The mission leader, a veteran diplomat with 40 years of experience in interspecies relations, had opened an establishment that served something called fusion food and claimed to be the happiest he'd been in decades. The third diplomatic mission returned early, filing a report that consisted entirely of the phrase "we need to reconsider our approach" repeated for 37 pages. It was around this time that the Zephyrian Empire began to take notice. Huntmaster Krixtol, primary military coordinator for the Empire's border security forces, had initially dismissed human activities as the thrashing of primitive mammals who would either learn their place or be eliminated by more competent predators. The Zephyrians, after all, had dealt with countless upstart species over the millennia. The pattern was always the same: initial aggression based on ignorance, followed by swift correction through overwhelming force, followed by either extinction or submission, but humans were proving remarkably resistant to correction. The first direct confrontation had occurred when human traders entered what the Zephyrians considered their exclusive territory. Standard protocol called for a demonstration of force. A single Zephyrian bioship would intercept the intruders, deliver the appropriate warnings, and either accept their surrender or eliminate them as an example to others. The bioship devouring silence, a 600-meter example of Zephyrian bioengineering at its finest, had intercepted the human vessel Wandering Star near the Kepler 442 system. The engagement should have lasted approximately 4 minutes, including time for the traditional pre-combat intimidation display. Instead, it lasted 6 hours and ended with the devouring silence limping back to base while transmitting damage reports that made the fleet commanders question whether their translation software was malfunctioning. According to the bioship's sensory records, the humans had somehow convinced their cargo containers to function as improvised kinetic weapons, used their navigation deflectors to create focused electromagnetic pulse attacks, and at one point had actually managed to temporarily hack into the bioship's neural networks using what appeared to be a modified communications array and sheer audacity. The Wandering Star had eventually withdrawn from Zephyrian space, but not before its captain had transmitted a message that roughly translated to, "Thanks for the interesting conversation, maybe we can do this again sometime," along with detailed tactical analyses of Zephyrian bioship vulnerabilities that were disturbingly accurate. Krikstal had personally reviewed the engagement records 17 times, each viewing revealing new aspects of human tactical thinking that defied conventional military doctrine. The humans hadn't just fought, they had improvised, adapted, and actually seemed to be enjoying themselves. Their communications during the battle had included what appeared to be jokes, casual observations about Zephyrian technology, and at one point, a detailed recipe for something called pancakes that was apparently being shared among the crew while they were actively under fire. The second confrontation had been planned more carefully. A full squadron of bioships, coordinated through the HiveMind network and equipped with adaptive countermeasures designed to neutralize human improvisation tactics. The engagement took place near the TRAPPIST-1 system, where a human exploration vessel had been conducting what they claimed were routine surveys in space that the Zephyrians had claimed for future expansion. The battle lasted 3 days. By the end of it, 2 bioships were undergoing extensive regeneration therapy. One had suffered what could only be described as a nervous breakdown and was refusing to respond to HiveMind commands, and the human vessel had somehow managed to capture and reprogram a squadron of Zephyrian combat drones to perform what their crew called synchronized swimming routines, while broadcasting human music across all military frequencies. The human captain, a woman named Elena Rodriguez, had concluded the engagement by inviting the Zephyrian squadron commander to what she termed a proper discussion over drinks at the nearest neutral station. When Krikstal had declined, Rodriguez had expressed regret and transmitted a care package containing human recreational substances, entertainment media, and a handwritten note suggesting that Krikstal needed to relax more. The care package had been analyzed by Zephyrian biotechnicians and found to contain nothing harmful, just various human cultural artifacts that defied easy categorization. The entertainment media had proven particularly puzzling, consisting of what appeared to be recordings of humans engaged in various forms of ritualized combat, artistic expression, and something called situation comedy that seemed to involve humans creating and resolving social conflicts for entertainment purposes. But it was the handwritten note that had truly disturbed the Empire's leadership, not because it contained threats or strategic intelligence, but because it demonstrated that this human captain had somehow developed an accurate psychological profile of a Zephyrian military commander based on a single combat engagement. The note's suggestions for stress management were not only surprisingly practical, but showed an understanding of Zephyrian biology that should have required years of careful study. The third confrontation never happened. Instead, Krikstal received an invitation. Captain Rex Donovan of the Defiant Wanderer had apparently heard about the previous encounters through what humans called the grapevine, which seemed to be an informal information network that operated faster than official diplomatic channels. His message was brief, direct, and contained an offer that no proper Zephyrian should have considered for even a moment. "Huntmaster Krikstal," the message began. "Word is you've been having interesting conversations with my fellow humans. I'm thinking maybe it's time we had a more direct discussion about mutual interests. There's a situation brewing in the Vega sector that might benefit from both our particular skill sets. Interested in seeing what happens when the galaxy's 2 most effective predator species stop trying to kill each other and start working together? Meet me at Freeport Station, Docking Bay 7. I'll bring the coffee, you bring that tactical brilliance I keep hearing about." The message had concluded with what appeared to be a human joke. "Don't worry about bringing weapons. Where we're going, we'll probably need to improvise anyway." Krikstal had stared at the message for approximately 6 hours, during which time 17 different military scenarios had been analyzed by the HiveMind network. Every tactical assessment had reached the same conclusion. Meeting with this human represented either a catastrophic security risk or an unprecedented opportunity, with no reliable method of determining which. The deciding factor had been a single line buried in the intelligence reports about human behavior. Humans appear to consider tactical challenges as forms of entertainment. For a species that had built an empire on the principle of overwhelming superiority, the concept of finding genuine challenge entertaining was both fascinating and terrifying, but Krixtal was, above all else, a warrior. And warriors, regardless of species, were drawn to worthy opponents like gravitational fields drew matter. The meeting at Freeport Station had been scheduled for 30 minutes. It lasted 6 hours. Donovan had indeed brought coffee, along with what he claimed were proper snacks for strategic planning. The snacks had turned out to be an assortment of human foods that were simultaneously nutritious and portable, designed for consumption during extended tactical discussions. The coffee was a stimulant beverage that Krixtal's bioanalysis had confirmed was both safe for Zephyrian consumption and remarkably effective at enhancing cognitive function. The conversation had begun with cautious professional courtesy and evolved into something that neither species had a proper term for. Humans called it shop talk, the kind of discussion that occurred when experts in the same field shared techniques, experiences, and professional observations without the usual constraints of formal diplomacy. Krixtal had described Zephyrian tactical doctrine, the careful application of overwhelming force, coordinated through hive mind networks to achieve objectives with maximum efficiency and minimum resource expenditure. Donovan had outlined human strategic thinking, the identification of unexpected solutions through creative problem-solving, adaptation to changing circumstances, and the tactical exploitation of opponent assumptions. The breakthrough had come when they began analyzing the Vega sector situation that Donovan had mentioned. A coalition of minor powers had been disrupting shipping lanes through a combination of piracy, territorial claims, and what could only be described as administrative harassment of legitimate traders. The situation was too complex for simple military solutions, but too chaotic for conventional diplomatic resolution. Individually, neither humans nor Zephyrians could address the problem effectively. The Zephyrians' standard approach of overwhelming force would work against the pirates, but would create diplomatic complications with the legitimate governments involved. Human-style improvisation could handle the administrative issues, but lacked the military strength to deal with the more serious threats. Together, however, they could create what Donovan called a comprehensive solution set. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Zephyrian bioships would provide overwhelming military superiority to eliminate the piracy threat, while human tactical creativity would devise methods of dealing with each challenge that were simultaneously effective and diplomatically palatable. The key was coordination, Zephyrian precision guided by human adaptability, creating a combined force that could address multiple problem types simultaneously. They tested the concept on a small scale first. A group of raiders had been harassing civilian transports near the Kepler 186 system, using hit-and-run tactics that made conventional military responses ineffective. The raiders were too mobile for standard pursuit, too well-informed to be surprised by conventional tactics, and too well-connected politically to be eliminated without diplomatic consequences. The joint human-Zephyrian operation lasted exactly 4 hours. Donovan's crew had identified the raiders' information sources and fed them false intelligence about a particularly valuable convoy routing through the system. Meanwhile, Krixtal's bioship had positioned itself along the raiders' most likely approach vector, using Zephyrian stealth technology to remain undetected until the optimal moment. When the raiders moved to intercept the fictional convoy, they found themselves facing what appeared to be a standard human cargo hauler. As they moved in for what should have been a routine raid, the cargo ship suddenly revealed itself to be the defiant wanderer in disguise, while simultaneously a Zephyrian bioship materialized from what had appeared to be empty space. The raiders surrendered immediately, but the elegant part of the operation was what happened next. Rather than simply destroying the raiders or turning them over to local authorities, the human Zephyrian team had implemented what Donovan called corrective rehabilitation. The raiders were given a choice: face trial for piracy with the considerable evidence that had been compiled against them, or accept supervised employment with legitimate shipping companies that were willing to hire former criminals in exchange for detailed knowledge of raider tactics and hideouts. Most chose employment. Those who didn't were turned over to authorities along with comprehensive evidence packages that ensured swift conviction. Within 2 weeks, the entire raider network in the Kepler 186 system had been eliminated or converted into legitimate commerce protection services. The operation's success had not gone unnoticed. News of the human-Zephyrian cooperation spread through unofficial channels with the kind of speed usually reserved for really good gossip or really bad news. In this case, it qualified as both. Ambassador Thualdin had been among the first to grasp the implications. A species that treated tactical challenges as entertainment had somehow convinced the galaxy's apex predators to join them in what amounted to military-grade problem-solving for fun and profit. The ambassador's emergency report to the crystalline hegemony had been brief and to the point. "We may have a situation." Director Malak of the Trade Federation had reached similar conclusions through economic analysis. The efficiency of the joint human-Zephyrian operation had reduced piracy-related shipping insurance costs by 47% in a single system. If similar operations were conducted galaxy-wide, the economic implications would be staggering. But more disturbing than the economic efficiency was the operational flexibility the partnership demonstrated. They weren't just more effective than either species operating alone, they were more effective in ways that suggested fundamental changes to how galactic security could be maintained. The real panic had begun when intelligence reports confirmed that the partnership was expanding. Captain Donovan had apparently introduced Huntmaster Crixtol to other human military commanders, while Crixtol had shared tactical analyses with other Zephyrian Huntmasters. What had started as a single experimental cooperation was evolving into systematic interspecies tactical integration. The second joint operation had targeted a more complex problem, a trade dispute between 3 different species that had escalated into localized warfare, disrupting commerce across 17 systems. Traditional diplomatic solutions had failed because each species had legitimate grievances, and none were willing to compromise on issues they considered essential to their cultural survival. The human Zephyrian team had approached the problem with what they called creative mediation. First, they had analyzed the underlying causes of the conflict and identified points where each species' interests could be aligned with mutual benefit. Then they had used a combination of Zephyrian technological superiority and human social engineering to create circumstances where cooperation became more profitable than continued conflict. The method was surprisingly simple. They had offered each species something they wanted more than victory in the current conflict, contingent on peaceful resolution of the dispute. The Vrex Confederation had received advanced bioship technology in exchange for territorial concessions. The Nexus Collective had been granted exclusive trading rights in previously contested systems in exchange for cultural autonomy agreements. The Spiral Coalition had received military protection guarantees in exchange for resource-sharing agreements. Each species had emerged from the mediation convinced that they had achieved their primary objectives while making only minor concessions. The human Zephyrian team had achieved system-wide peace while establishing a framework for future conflict resolution that other species could adapt for their own use. The third operation had been even more ambitious. A coalition of criminal organizations had been operating across multiple systems, using political corruption and economic manipulation to maintain power structures that conventional law enforcement couldn't address. The criminals were too well connected for military solutions, too distributed for police operations, and too economically integrated for simple arrest and prosecution approaches. The human Zephyrian solution had been to treat the entire criminal network as a strategic puzzle requiring multiple simultaneous approaches. Zephyrian intelligence capabilities had mapped the complete organizational structure, identifying key individuals, resource flows, and operational dependencies. Human social analysis had identified psychological pressure points, cultural vulnerabilities, and economic incentives that could be exploited to turn the criminal organization against itself. The operation had unfolded like a carefully choreographed performance. Financial pressure applied at specific points had forced criminal leaders to make increasingly desperate decisions. Information warfare had convinced different factions within the organization that they were being betrayed by their allies. Economic incentives had been offered to mid-level operators, encouraging defection with promises of legitimate employment. Within 6 months, the criminal coalition had collapsed entirely, with most of its former members either in custody, dead in internal conflicts, or operating legitimate businesses under assumed identities. But it was the fourth operation that had really gotten the galaxy's attention. The hegemony crisis had been brewing for years. The Antares hegemony, a coalition of militaristic species, had been expanding aggressively into neutral space, using a combination of military intimidation and economic pressure to force smaller civilizations into tributary relationships. The situation was too complex for simple military intervention, as the hegemony had legitimate territorial claims mixed in with their aggressive expansion. Diplomatic solutions had failed because the hegemony's leadership genuinely believed that their expansion was both necessary for their species' survival and beneficial for the civilizations they were absorbing. Most observers had predicted that the crisis would eventually escalate into a galaxy-wide war, as various powers were forced to choose between accepting hegemony expansion or military resistance that could spiral out of control. The human Zephyrian team had treated the entire crisis as a large-scale tactical problem requiring what they called comprehensive systems intervention. Their solution had been breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Rather than addressing the hegemony's expansion directly, they had systematically altered the strategic environment in which the expansion was taking place. First, they had established alternative security arrangements for the threatened civilizations, using a combination of Zephyrian military technology and human tactical training to create defensive capabilities that made hegemony expansion militarily impractical. Then they had created economic incentives that made peaceful cooperation more profitable than territorial conquest. Finally, they had engineered diplomatic situations that gave hegemony leadership opportunities to achieve their strategic objectives through negotiation rather than expansion. The entire operation had taken 18 months and had involved coordination between 47 different species across 12 sectors. The hegemony crisis had been resolved without a single major military engagement, with all parties achieving their essential objectives while avoiding the catastrophic warfare that everyone had expected. The galaxy had been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The partnership between humanity and the Zephyrian Empire wasn't just effective. It was so effective that it was changing the fundamental nature of how interstellar conflicts could be resolved. Species that had spent centuries perfecting military strategies for survival were discovering that human Zephyrian teams could achieve better results through what amounted to strategic problem-solving. Civilizations that had built their entire cultures around warrior traditions were finding that their traditional enemies were now more interested in tactical collaboration than territorial conquest. The panic had been immediate and galaxy-wide. Emergency sessions had been convened by every major galactic organization. The crystalline hegemony had demanded immediate investigation into what they termed the unprecedented strategic threat posed by human Zephyrian cooperation. The Trade Federation had filed formal complaints about unfair competitive advantages created by interspecies tactical integration. The Void Swimmers had emerged from their alternate dimensions to express concern about reality-altering partnership dynamics, but the most telling response had come from the Antares hegemony itself. Their military leadership had submitted a formal request to join the human Zephyrian tactical integration program. The request had been followed by similar applications from 17 other species, each seeking to gain access to the strategic advantages demonstrated by human Zephyrian cooperation. Within months, what had started as an experimental partnership between two species had evolved into a galaxy-wide movement toward collaborative tactical problem-solving. The irony was not lost on careful observers. For millennia, the galaxy had maintained peace through a careful balance of power based on mutual fear and strategic deterrence. The Zephyrian Empire had been the apex predator that everyone else feared, while various other species had maintained secondary positions in the galactic hierarchy through their own specialized advantages. The introduction of humanity had disrupted this balance, not through superior force or technology, but through a fundamentally different approach to strategic thinking. Humans treated conflicts as puzzles to be solved rather than battles to be won, and their partnership with the Zephyrians had demonstrated that this approach could be devastatingly effective. The result was a new form of galactic stability, based not on fear of any single dominant power, but on the recognition that complex problems could be addressed more effectively through collaborative intelligence than through military force. Species that had spent centuries as enemies were discovering that they could accomplish more as tactical partners than as opponents. Military resources that had been devoted to preparing for inevitable conflicts were being redirected toward collaborative problem-solving initiatives. Economic systems that had been based on competitive advantage were evolving toward cooperative efficiency models. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. There were still conflicts, still territorial disputes, still species that preferred traditional approaches to interstellar relations. But the demonstration effect of human Zephyrian cooperation had fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. Captain Donovan and Huntmaster Crixtal had continued their partnership, expanding their operations to address increasingly complex challenges. Their success had inspired imitators, competitors, and critics, but it had also established a new paradigm for how different species could work together. The galaxy had learned to fear the partnership between humanity and the Zephyrian Empire, but that fear had evolved into something more complex, recognition that the galaxy's two most effective predator species had discovered something more powerful than predation. They had discovered cooperation, new form of order based on collaborative problem-solving rather than competitive dominance. The galaxy had panicked when the two deadliest species teamed up, but in the end, that panic had forced everyone to discover that there were alternatives to being deadly. And perhaps, in a galaxy full of predators, that was the most revolutionary discovery of all.